What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be discussing shadows and contrast in street photography. We'll be discussing some tips, some techniques, and also giving you some practical, real-world examples behind the scenes from my point of view. And so hopefully you'll stay tuned to the end of the video where I will share with you exactly how I use shadows and contrast on the streets and real-world application examples where I believe the only real way to learn and to use these techniques is out there in the world, putting them into practice. And so use these videos, use these slideshows and these thoughts and ideas as a way for you to build a foundation and then actually go out there and do the thing. So I encourage you to stay tuned as we will be looking at some more in-depth videos and behind the scenes content that can hopefully give you more insight on how I do this thing. And so I believe that shadows, light, contrast, these very simple elements within a photograph can take a moment that is so simple and mundane to a transcendental height where we can go beyond this world and create a new world through the act of making a photograph. And so here in New Jersey, as I was observant of the way that light and shadow play interacted upon this wall, I was watching and observing as the different families were gathered waiting for ice cream in line in relationship to the boardwalk and the hustle and bustle on the right-hand side in the background. And so I was using this beautiful light during the golden hour where we have long looming shadows to my advantage to create this more dramatic frame, simply observing the way that shadows play. And so as the child was interacting with the parents here at the scene, I made the photograph of the moment that actually is such a emotional and joyous moment, but you actually do not see a physical or a real person in the frame. You see a depiction of the moment through the use of shadow play. And I seem to use light and shadow play in various situations as a way for me to create more mystery and create more dramatic effect in the photographs, where we can create an emotionally impactful photograph simply through the use of light and shadow. And so I find that the role of shadows can add this sense of depth and drama and mystery to an image where they're just as important as the light itself. Here at this scene in Zambia, photographing as the children are playing against this empty frame and this beautiful backdrop, observing the way that light and shadow casts upon the wall. And as the boy moved in and out of the shadow area, his eye was revealed, crushing the shadows, adding mystery and depth to this photograph through the use of the shadow of the girl casted upon the wall. We have many different planes here. We have some shape and some form that was created through the drama of light and shadow. And so in Rome, as I photographed at this particular scene, I used the shadow as my building block. And so sometimes when I'm on the streets and composing a photograph, I work from back to front. And so, of course, this Colosseum here in Rome was my first interest in the photograph. And so I was patient and observant and aware that by positioning myself at this particular place during the golden hour, the Colosseum would be illuminated in the beautiful golden light. However, the one thing that I paid attention to very closely was the interplay between the shadows and the people moving in and out of my frame. And so I'm going to highlight in yellow here on the left-hand side of the frame that second element that I plugged into my composition, which was this patch of light and the way the people's shadows casted upon it. And so I was essentially treating this photograph, treating this moment as a visual puzzle, working from back to front, and then being patient and waiting for what I'm highlighting in green here being the final element, the person, the gesture, the face, the human element that entered my frame. And so simple technique here, working from back to front, working in a way that allows me to compose much more intuitively. By positioning these subjects in this way, we create a photograph with a strong composition and strong form, using light and shadow play, and using that shadow casted upon the wall as the cherry on top, the thing that gives the photograph a bit more depth and visual interest. And so I believe that we can use shadows as a way to guide the eye throughout the frame, similar to the use of the shadow on that wall in Rome, where they can create leading lines. They can isolate subjects and block out distractions, adding texture and mood to a scene. And so use shadows and use the interplay between the light in relationship to the backgrounds that you're photographing to guide the viewer's eye, where sometimes when I'm photographing, I simply see a car move on by and I crush the shadows and expose for the highlights in order to add contrast to my photograph, and this beautiful old white automobile entered my frame at the perfect time as I was able to expose for the highlights and crush the superfluous details in the shadow, creating contrast. And so by underexposing, you can deepen the shadows. By using spot metering for the highlights with your camera, you can essentially prevent overexposure, allowing those deep looming shadows to be crushed in the deep dark color of black, where the negative space can be used effectively and create this dramatic scene in the photographs that we make. And so sometimes when I'm photographing, I underexpose. Here at this scene at Penn's Landing, Philadelphia, I underexposed by one stop. And by underexposing for one stop and using the highlight weighted metering mode, I was able to expose for the highlights and crush the shadows, placing these birds in flight in a very ambiguous location, adding mystery and drama to the frame. And so there are a few simple techniques that we can use to create strong contrast and more compelling imagery. And so here in Mexico City, when I photographed at this particular scene, it was a very bustling market, and there was almost too much chaos for me to work with. And so I positioned myself in front of this beautiful illuminated mural here, this very beautiful, colorful mural in relationship to the shadows that were casted from the bridge. And so I had this interplay between light and shadow and popping color to work with. And so by looking for this high contrast environment underneath this bridge, I essentially experimented with the positioning of my subject in relationship to the light and shadow play. And by waiting for that moment as the person entered the shadows, I was able to illuminate his gesture and crush the face and have a more mysterious and dramatic photograph from a mundane moment and elevating it to an extraordinary height, where the use of light and shadow play can create more dramatic imagery. It's a very simple approach by crushing the shadows and bringing forth what's most important in the highlights, where the play of light and dark was famously used by painters like Caravaggio through the use of chiaroscuro, where high contrast can enhance a story. Here we have The Calling of Matthew by Caravaggio, where we have a beautiful use of chiaroscuro. The high contrast effect of light and shadow can add a sense of beauty to a photograph by simply exposing for the highlights, crushing the shadows, and setting a stage. So here's an example that I made of a scene in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And so I was observant of the way the light casted at this place, and I was inside of a tunnel, and I had the beautiful opportunity to wait and be patient and fish at the scene. And by working the scene and waiting for things to unfold, I was able to bring forth the workers and the pedestrians, the shoppers, and the different elements in the frame that are popping with color and light and crushing the shadows and the details of the shops that they are shopping at, as this use of chiaroscuro at this particular scene in Bethlehem was elevated and something that allowed me to isolate subjects and add this sense of space, this ambiguous space that isn't necessarily anywhere in particular. You wouldn't necessarily know exactly where this photograph was made because I crushed the shadows and exposed for the highlights. And so I believe that one practical exercise that you can go out and execute for yourself is to simply go out there and photograph a scene only using shadows as the main compositional element. Here at this scene in Philadelphia, I was observant of the way that the light and the shadows were casted upon this reflection in the puddle. After the rainy day, I was observant of the way that I could use these elements within my frame to elevate the mundane and to observe these Jewish men here celebrating during Shabbat. I essentially made this dramatic and more interesting and mysterious photograph because of the use of the shadows. And it's not necessarily the most obvious photograph, and so by using shadows, you can add a sense of mystery. And I encourage you to go out there and play and experiment with the use of light and shadow as a way for you to be more warmed up and ready when these scenes unfold, and you can use the use of light and shadow more intuitively. And so go out there and put it into practice, and I will share with you some behind the scenes videos of how I use light and shadow play in practice here at this scene at Penn's Landing, Philadelphia. I'm essentially photographing the use of silhouettes. I'm using silhouettes casted upon the beautiful blue backdrop of this sky here. And I was observing as the children were playing at the playground, swinging. And so as they were swinging and flying their bodies up into the air, I was waiting for the moment for them to be separated from the blue sky, exposing for the highlights, crushing the shadows, and making sure that I'm there at a low angle, dropping low to create this photo where I essentially was able to fit the different puzzle pieces in my frame and add this depth and use shadows in my picture as a way to elevate the mundane moment of children playing through the use of light and shadow. And so I can do this time and time again in the same location, where here at Penn's Landing, I am understanding of the way that the light is casted. I understand that there's an amusement park and there's an opportunity for you to photograph and isolate subjects in flight, in the air, against the blue-black backdrop. I'm aware of the way that light and shadow play interacts at this particular place, as it's a very open space, and so the light always hits here nicely. And so I can use the interplay between light and shadow to my advantage by going out there and practicing day after day at different times of the day at the same location. And so I can photograph with repetition. I can become very consistent with the use of light and shadow play because of the way that I understand it and practice at the same place over and over again. And so I find that this video example here of these bikers passing by is another great example of the use of light and shadow. And so I'm essentially positioning myself in a particular way where I'm observant of the way the light and shadow play is interacting because of the way the light is being blocked by this fence here. And so you can see the way the shadows are casted. We have a silhouette in the foreground. We have that interplay between light and shadow on the subject in the middle ground. And then finally in the background, the other boy is perfectly illuminated in the light. And so we have three different planes here. We have three different layers here and three different uses of light. We have a silhouette, we have some shadow play, and we have the beautiful illumination of the light there in the background. And so by positioning yourself in a particular way and at a particular space where the light and shadow play is very prevalent, whether there's a tunnel, a bridge, some structure like a fence blocking the light, we can create a more dramatic and compelling image. And so here under the bridge in Penn's Landing, I photographed and waited as people passed in and out of the frame and entered the patch of light. And by understanding the different relationships I can make between the light and shadow play, I waited for the subject to come into the illumination of the light to add this sense of space and drama to the frame. And so I do this time and time again at the same place, photographing with repetition and practice. And so I encourage you to go out there and to find locations where you can put this into practice. Penn's Landing is one in particular that I am very fond of and have gone back to time and time again as I am understanding of the way the light casts here at certain times of the day. And so I wanted to wrap this video up with a final behind the scenes video where I'm photographing at this particular scene, and it's a very beautiful use of the golden light. And during the golden hour, we have long looming shadows. And so pay attention as I enter this scene here. And so you can see as I work the scene, I'm observant of the woman doing her makeup. I get a bit closer. I'm very interested in the light and shadow play. I have this beautiful backdrop of these clouds. We have the amusement ride. And then finally, I make the frame. And so by observing these different times of day and photographing and observing the way the shadows are casted upon the wall and the way that the golden light casts these long looming shadows, we can create more depth in our photography. And I find that the use of light and shadow can take something so ordinary, so mundane, like a group of friends hanging out here during the sunset, to an extraordinary height through the use of light and shadow. And so I encourage you to go out there and to create more striking and high impact photographs through the use of light and shadow, for that's what I believe light and shadow play can do in a frame. Here we have a final photo that I've made in Jericho as the rainbow appeared after a quick rainstorm, and the boy goes to throw a stone towards the rainbow, and the shadow play between him and the boys around him make this more mysterious image, and I find that it can enhance the story in the photographs we create. So use contrast creatively. Use it in a way to enhance your photography. Don't necessarily rely on it as a crutch, as a simple solution for you to go out there and, oh, I'm just going to make silhouette photos today. But use it as a way to layer different things and have the interplay between light and shadow elevate the moment and not necessarily be the thing itself that carries the moment. And so I encourage you to go out there and explore the use of light and shadow. Photograph at different times a day. Find a location where you can go back time and time again and practice with repetition, and go out there in the real world and do the thing itself. And so thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace. Cheers.